On long winter nights, silent figures drift along brightly lit boulevards. Glass towers cast their cold glow onto the streets below. In austere rooms, devoid of greenery, only the click of keyboards and watchful eyes track the smallest fluctuations of numbers. Money, power, information. Three currents that never truly merge, yet they intertwine like invisible threads, tightening their grip on the destiny of an entire society. Perhaps never before has the fate of millions been decided by a single keystroke somewhere in a hidden office. Financial corporations, vast networks of power. Those who control the flow of capital not only operate the colossal machinery of the economy, but also silently rewrite the rules of the game. They blur the lines between truth and illusion, turning each individual into a tiny piece of a grand map that only they can fully see. What we call stability or chaos is often merely the outcome of a predetermined deal, a strategically leaked piece of information, or a media campaign designed to sway public sentiment. But if money is a double-edged sword and power the most unpredictable force on earth, who truly holds the key to the fate of modern society? What transforms market fluctuations into an unstoppable chain reaction? Which hands are betting on the future of an entire nation, yet none dare to step into the light? Is every cycle of prosperity and decline merely a more sophisticated repetition, or is there something more waiting to be revealed beyond the familiar stage curtain? Each person carries a piece of the answer, but only those brave and patient enough will dare to trace every footprint, to journey against the prevailing winds of the masses, to discern truth from falsehood within the labyrinth of power and money. Starting with a small question, an entirely new world can open, where old limits are challenged, and every assumption needs to be re-examined from the ground up. A cold wind swept across the European skies. Ancient castles were mere fading shadows in the new game of power. Somewhere, men in dark suits with sharp eyes quietly positioned their chess pieces. As the aristocracy gradually receded into the background, banking families silently advanced onto the stage, weaving invisible threads that tightened their grip on the continent's destiny. Each lineage was a piece of a colossal puzzle, where true power lay not in crowded parliaments, but within signed contracts, encrypted letters, and hurried handshakes behind velvet curtains. Germany at that time was not only a land of philosophy and poetry, but also a place where young financiers learned to connect, compete, and navigate the tides of war. From conspiracies to fund states to controlling a nation's entire money flow, these families formed alliances, then turned against each other, constantly transforming like the very currents of history. This interconnectedness was not merely cooperation, but a series of intertwined interests, sometimes bound by marriages, at other times torn apart by greed or the fear of being excluded from the game. In major deals, names like Rothschilds emerged as shapers of a continent's fate. Wartime loans, investments in railways and heavy industry, even influencing the destinies of kings and nations. The banking world was not simply about numbers. It was where the smallest decisions could alter the fate of millions, where patient, persistent individuals wove networks of influence far beyond national borders. A contract signed in Berlin could cause a distant overseas monarchy to crumble. These banking families, outwardly serene but inwardly brimming with unseen calculations, always exploited every political upheaval, every power vacuum, to consolidate their position across generations. Names like Rothschilds became symbols of power transcending time, for they possessed not only wealth but also secrets, holding the fears and aspirations of kings and presidents. If political power could rise and fall swiftly, financial power endured tenaciously, silently, like an underground current. To control it, these families had to constantly innovate their strategies, unafraid of alliances, ready to turn friends into foes and vice versa. It was a merciless game where loyalty was always tested, and the strongest was not the one with the most money, but the one who could see further, knowing when to take risks and when to retreat. Behind the names recorded in history books, the real decisions unfolded in quiet meeting rooms, witnessed by only a few, where a nod or a promise could shift the global balance. No one was an outsider in this grand game. Whenever a war erupted, the banks were always there, quietly betting on both sides, ensuring that no matter who won, they would still profit. The true power of banking families lay not in direct political control, but in their ability to control what governed politics, money, information, and society's belief in symbols of authority. Occasionally, a secret agreement, a diplomatic letter, or even a brief encounter at a party was enough to rewrite a century's history. On certain dark nights, Berlin became the epicenter of calculations understood only by the financial elite. While the populace slept, multi-million-dollar contracts changed hands. Negotiations stretched from dusk till dawn, sometimes just for a single privilege, a guarantee that the flow of money would remain in their grasp. Beyond merely funding nations, these families sought to interfere with leadership appointments, even pressuring to alter the economic development strategies of entire empires throughout history. Many wars, seemingly stemming from political conflicts, were in fact the result of struggles between major financial groups. Beneath the veneer of cooperation, relentless competition between banking families fueled every European transformation. Every fluctuation in the financial market was a warning to those complacent in victory, for a single small mistake could cause an entire financial empire to vanish, as happened to many renowned families in the past. However, most of the major players endured, overcoming every challenge with rare persistence and flexibility, unafraid to sacrifice minor interests for long-term power. Every page of history written was the result of thousands of calculations in the shadows. Just when everything seemed settled, new variables emerged, forcing banking families to change strategies, seek new alliances, sometimes even with their traditional rivals. In this game, there was no place for the naive or those swayed by fleeting emotions. Only those who truly understood the nature of power, the ceaseless movement of money and human desires, could survive and dictate the fate of an entire world. From the dense shadows of Berlin, the flow of capital continued west, winding through London's ancient streets and cobblestone squares. This city quickly became the new heart of financial power, where every decision, large or small, was weighed with an inscrutable calmness. Unlike bustling markets, this was the stage for meticulous chess games, where major banks together established entirely new rules for the world. London was not merely the capital of an empire, but also a gathering place for sharp minds, intellects capable of seeing beyond politics or commerce. Banking families once thriving in Germany and France now converged in the city of London, collaborating or competing with indigenous dynasties like Baring and Morgan. All shared a common goal: to control and dominate global financial flows. Deals involving gold, government bonds, or war loans were discussed in an atmosphere thick with power and secrecy, where a whispered word could send shivers down the spines of the faint-hearted. No one could deny London's role in reshaping the world order. Here, power was not conferred by medals or decrees, but by absolute trust in the banking system, in the value of a financial commitment. Major historical events, from world wars to global financial crises, bore the deep imprint of London's magnates. They acted not only as financiers, but also as shapers of the continent's future through decisions that carried more weight than any parliamentary resolution. Beneath the thick morning fog, currency transactions were decided in silence. Gold prices constantly shifted to the rhythm of phone calls from small offices, more powerful than any palace. Among the major banks, relationships were not merely cooperation or competition, but an intricate web of interwoven interests. When one bank faced difficulty, the others immediately adjusted their strategies, protected their positions, or seized opportunities to gain new advantages. Financial maneuvering in London was a long series of secret agreements, of negotiations that never truly ended. Banks learned to survive through absolute shrewdness and flexibility, never revealing their full intentions to anyone, even those within the same alliance. This very mystery created the special allure of the City of London, making it an indispensable destination for every banking family craving global power. Amidst prolonged meetings, thick contracts, and endless numbers on ledgers, every decision was meticulously weighed, not just for immediate profit, but for its long-term impact on the entire global landscape. A bank failure in London could shake European markets, triggering a cascade of unpredictable economic and political consequences. Those who controlled the City of London, who controlled its banking system, could almost dictate the pulse of the world's finances. Behind the grandeur of ancient buildings lay ruthless struggles, constant shifts between allies and adversaries. Not infrequently, families once closely allied became sworn enemies due to minor conflicts of interest or the emergence of a new opportunity. Stories of betrayal, failed ventures, and cold handshakes between winners and losers silently permeated every dark corner of the city. However, to view London merely as a center of calculation and coldness would be incomplete. This was also the birthplace of reformist ideas, new advancements in financial technology, and bold strategies that reshaped the very structure of the world market. Every event, every fluctuation left a deep mark, spurring banks to continuously innovate, adapt, and develop. Every failure was a lesson, every success a solid step forward for the entire system. The story of London was not just about numbers, but also about human ambition and the obsession with power. From here, the flow of capital continued south, merging into new conflicts in France, where the battle for financial control entered a new chapter, full of suspense and drama. Seamlessly connected to the game in England, France emerged not only as a land of political revolutions, but also as a stage for unprecedented monetary upheavals. It was where banking families continued their power narrative with bigger, riskier, and more dangerous stakes than ever before. The financial current, bearing the weight of history, continued to weave through the opulent avenues of Paris, where ancient, moss-covered buildings had witnessed countless ups and downs. There, French banking families like Fouad, Mallet, and Perrier refused to stay out of the game, determined to enter the heart of the power vortex, decisive and daring, like those who knew no one would grant opportunities, but one must seize them oneself. Alongside them were familiar foreign names. The Rothschilds remained resilient, like blood flowing beneath the skin of the French economy, steadily expanding their influence with cold patience and decisions that were sometimes ruthless. Unlike England and Germany, Paris was a place where monetary power was built not only on contracts, but also on a spirit of rebellion, on waves of revolution, sometimes gentle, sometimes furious. Every historical event here was linked to profound shifts in the flow of money. Each change in regime saw financiers recalculate their positions, whether proactive or reactive, inseparable from the manipulating hand of money. When the Credit Mobilier was born, the ambition to completely restructure French finance erupted fiercely. But that very ambition also ignited a chain of merciless power struggles between interest groups. The competition among families was not just about numbers, but a clash of visions, resilience, and adaptability to all social changes. In those tumultuous years, when revolutions broke out, not infrequently did French financiers choose to operate behind the scenes, providing funds to both sides, ensuring that no matter who won, they maintained a certain degree of control. This was the survival instinct of those who deeply understood the power of money, how real power moved in the shadows, not in the dazzling lights of political forums. The presence of international banks further complicated the game. For every investment, every foreign capital flow carried invisible constraints, forcing French families to constantly seek a new balance between internal and external forces. Many believed that financial power in France was a continuation of what happened in Germany and England. But in Paris, it had its own distinct flavor, a blend of old and new, tradition, and a desire for change. The major players were not afraid to switch roles, from investors to founders, from partners to rivals, from friends to competitors. With bold and sometimes risky decisions, they contributed to pushing the French economy into unpredictable cycles of boom and bust, but also created a remarkable developmental impetus whose true value only those daring enough could comprehend. Inside every quiet meeting room, polite yet resolute individuals constantly forged agreements and commitments whose consequences could last for generations. The complex connections between major banking families, short-term cooperation interspersed with long-term competition, all merged into a multi-layered picture where every shift left an indelible mark on the nation's history. The rise and fall of major banking corporations like Credit Mobilier were living proof of the harsh law of the power game. Only those resilient, flexible, and visionary enough could survive the raging waves. The links between French financiers and international banking families not only expanded their power, but also created unforeseen risks. There were times when such cooperation became a burden, when one party fell or when interests diverged. Every economic crisis, every political upheaval was a test of courage for each individual, each family. Not everyone could rise after failure. But it was from these very collapses that new generations emerged, stronger, wiser, daring to face all the challenges of their time. Money was not just a means, but also a tool to temper will and intellect. Power lay not only in financial reports, but also in decisiveness during moments of peril, in the ability to read the times and never cease seeking new opportunities. That was why financial power in France never remained static, but constantly transformed, adapted, and was ready to change with the pulse of history. All of this created a continuous current flowing from somber Germany through cautious London to fervent Paris, where every ambition was tested to its limits, and every achievement was bought with intellect, courage, and sometimes even blood and tears. Even as the financial power struggles in Paris were far from over, the flow of power had already begun to expand, intertwining the destinies of German, British, and French banks. Each place had its own character, its own unique spirit, yet all aimed at one goal: to hold the strings that controlled the fate of an entire Europe. Hidden beneath polite handshakes was a subtle competition, where each family was both ally and rival. Step by step, decision by decision, every transfer of assets or formation of a new conglomerate carried the imprint of generations of calculation. Not just the courageous dared to enter this game, but those who knew when to wait, how to take one step back to advance three, how to turn friends into foes, and foes into friends as circumstances changed. The tapestry of power was woven from countless intricate connections. It was not easy to clearly delineate who was master and who was guest. A seemingly harmless agreement between two small banks could ignite a financial crisis that spread across the continent. A colossal debt created in Berlin, a strategic investment from London, a risky venture in Paris, all could simultaneously stir the already calculating atmosphere of Europe. Here, money was not just a means, but the language of power, a tool to redraw order, to challenge institutions once thought inviolable. Each banking family extended beyond national borders, linking with media networks, industrial companies, and even governments and military circles when needed. They were willing to set aside personal conflicts to unite against a greater threat, or, conversely, to break alliances to gain an advantage for themselves. These were people who never rested on their laurels, always listening for the smallest signals from the market, ready to reverse course in an instant if they sensed an approaching storm. They understood that true power was only sustainable if it constantly adapted, changing before circumstances forced it to. The complexity of these transnational connections made all predictions fragile. During economic crises, the role of banks became even more pronounced. Just one decision to withdraw capital, one move to halt credit, could plunge an entire economy into chaos. It was precisely in such moments that the power of banking families fully revealed itself. Timely intervention could save a nation, while a cold cutoff of all support was enough to sink an entire regime. Through countless upheavals, historical lessons always reminded subsequent generations that everything could change. No position was permanent. One who stood at the peak of glory today might be relegated to the sidelines tomorrow. What allowed the power of banking families to endure for generations was not mere wealth, but their ability to grasp the times, to constantly learn and innovate their thinking. They were unafraid to change themselves, unwilling to cling to outdated methods, embracing the new, always maintaining a clear mind against all temptations of power. The connection between Berlin, London, and Paris was like a powerful underground current, never ceasing to flow, whether the surface was calm or turbulent. The stories of banking families are not just a history of money flows, but also a history of ambition, intellect, and cold, calculating choices. It is where the strongest do not need to speak loudly, for a single nod is enough to change the destiny of an entire nation. Every struggle ultimately leaves not an absolute victor, but a flexible power structure, ready to embrace all the changes of the times. From small rooms in Berlin, discreet offices in London, to luxurious salons in Paris, financial power silently operated, writing new chapters for the world, and every player in that grand game understood well that to survive, one needed more than a courageous heart. One needed a clear mind, an unyielding will, and eyes always fixed on the future. No one believed that this new land, with immigrants from all corners of the world, could transform into the global center of financial power in just 1 century. As waves of migration brought with them grand dreams, magnate families emerged in America, steady hands steering the destiny of capital. Not merely wanderers eager to change their lives, they carried experience from Europe's old financial hubs, then used audacity, strength, and even cunning to build new empires. Names like Morgan represented not just a lineage, but a symbol of power, ambition, and the ability to navigate immense capital flows across oceans. Morgan, with his shrewdness and foresight, once manipulated the entire bond market, saving the American banking system from collapse during its darkest hours. Rockefeller, in contrast, embodied steadfastness and persistence, building a network of oil control where his every decision influenced global energy prices. Between these two families lay countless clashes, collaborations, betrayals, and tacit compromises, forming a stage where power never stood still. The greatest turning point for America did not come from a war or a technological invention, but from the birth of the central banking system, where financial families played a central role in shaping the new rules. Secret negotiations on Jekyll Island changed American economic history, as a small group of powerful men sat down together to draft the blueprint for the Federal Reserve System. Every decision on currency, credit, and interest rates was no longer a random game, but became the product of carefully calculated strategies. Capital no longer flowed freely, but was always controlled by invisible hands, the true masters of America's destiny. The financial crisis of the early 20th century was no small test for these families. Each time the market plummeted, the banks had to reconvene, negotiate, and compromise, sometimes sacrificing personal interests to save the collective system. On long nights, banking tycoons stayed awake, signing agreements with just a handshake, trusting each other in moments when trust was the only thing that kept them afloat. Not only did they battle domestic rivals, but they also faced financial conglomerates from Europe, who were no less ambitious and cunning. The flow of power in America was a story of constant transformation, where every relationship could shift after a single crisis. Today's friend could become tomorrow's rival. No one dared to rest on their laurels, for a single small mistake could mean losing everything. The rise of major banking families, the formation of secret alliances, and the role of institutions like the Federal Reserve created an entirely new America, where government and financiers always moved in parallel, sometimes two sides of the same coin, simultaneously supporting and constraining each other. Looking back at that journey, it becomes clear that true power did not lie in what was loudly reported in the media, but in closed rooms where taciturn yet utterly decisive men made decisions that affected the lives of millions. The story does not end here. As America became the new center of the financial world, the storm of power began to spread across the ocean, bringing with it unpredictable upheavals. The flow of money, power, and ambition continued to surge, preparing for a new game where all boundaries could be blurred. After long nights of crisis, where American financial conglomerates struggled to maintain their position, the wave of power spread to Europe. There, the atmosphere was always tense with unending competition between major financial centers. Europe at this time was no longer a unified entity, but a colossal mosaic of nations, interest groups, and countless secrets buried beneath economic treaties and calculating political alliances. International financiers understood that every decision to withdraw capital, every movement of money, was not merely a matter for one bank, but a shift in the balance of power between superpowers behind the scenes. Major banks from Britain, France, Germany, along with transnational financial corporations, continuously bet on the continent's future. Instability arose not only from political conflicts, but also from waves of financial crises that could emerge at any time. The entire continent was like an endless gamble, where banking magnates were willing to stake everything to retain control. Many nations chose to form new alliances, building common economic blocs to limit the influence of foreign hands. But ultimately, they themselves were drawn into larger games orchestrated by financial families. In the old streets of Paris, London, and Berlin, stories circulated everywhere of sudden investments, secret mergers, or seemingly irrational bankruptcies that later revealed the fingerprints of familiar names. In those years, not just America but Europe too was like a living, constantly moving organism, where every capital flow was a lifeline connecting nations, and every financial decision could alter the fate of millions. Europe's instability was not simply the result of wars or social upheavals, but also the product of a silent power shift. International banking tycoons often chose to remain unseen, allowing politicians, intellectuals, and journalists to debate on the media front while they covertly manipulated resources from behind. An economic crisis erupted, factories closed en masse, stock prices plummeted. But only a very few knew the true cause, and even fewer could seize opportunities from those collapses. Major nations like Britain, France, Germany, and Italy all tried to control money flows through laws, tariff barriers, or even secret agreements. But in the end, the rules of the game still belonged to those who knew how to adjust strategy and were unafraid to sacrifice short-term interests for long-term power. Behind international treaties and agreements was an intricate system of relationships between banks, where a single nod could shatter an alliance or save an economy on the brink of collapse. When Europe's economic fluctuations reached their peak, American banks once again intervened in the big game with colossal loans and investment contracts. Transatlantic financial conglomerates gradually became the decisive factor in shaping the continent's destiny. It was a time when the boundaries between internal and external, between friend and foe, blurred, as all capital flowed towards the ultimate goal: absolute control, whether through direct routes or unexpected detours. The story of an unstable Europe was not just about parliamentary debates, but also about all-night parties, secret meetings, and undisclosed contracts. Banking families and transnational financial corporations intertwined their destinies with every nation, big and small, creating a power structure both fragile and robust, which only those patient, cold, and knowing when to wait could truly control. From Europe's successive financial tremors, another region silently prepared for a more drastic change, where crisis was not just economic recession, but the collapse of faith and the old order. Germany entered that gloomy period with deep wounds from war and hyperinflation, when money lost so much value that large denomination banknotes could no longer buy a loaf of bread. It was at this moment, when it seemed there was nothing left to lose, that a new path was forged, both audacious and fraught with risk. Those behind the financial scenes understood well that crisis was fertile ground for new power when the old system disintegrated. Anyone who controlled credit, who controlled the flow of money, could restructure an entire nation. In Germany, monetary and financial policies were redesigned at breakneck speed. The state began to deeply intervene in the economy. But behind that intervention was close cooperation with industrial conglomerates and banks, many of whose connections extended beyond national borders. The rise of Hitler cannot be separated from this financial context. He understood that political power was only sustainable when backed by economic strength. Massive reconstruction programs were launched, from infrastructure development to expanding heavy industry. All required enormous capital. The credit system was loosened in an unprecedented way. New financial instruments were created to stimulate production and create jobs. On the surface, it was a spectacular resurrection of a depleted nation, but deep within, it was the accumulation of financial power in the hands of a very small group of people who knew how to control the flow of money. Many international financial corporations chose to turn a blind eye to political ideologies and open their eyes wide to economic interests. Investments, trade contracts, and technology transfers continued silently, despite increasingly clear signals of a major impending conflict. For them, what mattered was not the flag, but the ability to generate returns, the strategic position in the emerging new order. These discreet handshakes helped the German economy accelerate rapidly, simultaneously creating a war machine that operated more smoothly than ever before. In that tense atmosphere, money became a weapon no less dangerous than guns and ammunition. Financial policies were used to control society, to direct production, to mobilize resources for long-term goals. Everything was organized like a large-scale campaign, where every expenditure served a final objective. The banking sector, industry, and the state apparatus merged, forming a tight power structure, difficult to break from within. Yet, this structure also carried the seeds of its own destruction. When power concentrated excessively, when every decision was driven by ambition, expansion, and control, the line between development and aggression became thin. The capital flows that once saved the economy now pushed all of Europe closer to the brink of an unprecedented catastrophe. Not everyone saw it at that moment, but those who truly understood the game of power knew that every investment today could be a price paid in blood and tears tomorrow. In the shadows of closed meeting rooms, decisions continued to be made, relentlessly, without hesitation. International financial families, colossal industrial conglomerates, and policymakers were all betting on the future in their own ways. No one wanted to be left out, because being left out meant accepting being swept away. And so, the wheel of history continued to turn, carrying both hope and fear, preparing to enter a more tumultuous phase, where all connections would be tested to their limits. The fluctuations of the era always brought unpredictable consequences, and the calculations in the shadows always left deep imprints on the destiny of the entire continent. As financial power centers constantly adjusted their strategies, nations big and small were drawn into an uneven game, where the rules frequently changed, and players could only adapt or be eliminated. The link between political, military, and financial power became so tight that there were no longer clear boundaries. Every decision in one area quickly spread to the others, forming a dense network that few could break from the outside. Behind events seemingly related to only one nation were invisible links connecting America, Europe, and Germany in the most tumultuous period. A loan in New York could save a major bank in Paris. An investment deal in London could determine the course of battle in Berlin. There was no room for the faint-hearted, because anyone who failed to adapt quickly would be mercilessly swept away. Transnational banking families, large industrial conglomerates, seasoned politicians, and even military officers all understood that only clear-headedness, flexibility, and persistent will could help them maintain their positions in the storm of power. The first cracks in the old order began with successive financial crises, spreading rapidly through economies that seemed most stable. Capital flowed like invisible undercurrents, carrying away all the hopes and fears of the market. Nations tried to establish new rules, building economic and political alliances to protect themselves. But all such efforts were merely weak dikes against the true flood of power. A new power structure gradually formed out of the chaos, with old figures but new roles, unprecedented alliances, and unforeseen betrayals. At the center of all fluctuations, international financial conglomerates continued to quietly operate, adjusting the rhythm of the world with seemingly invisible decisions that had the power to overthrow entire dynasties. They knew the value of information, the strength of networks, and the ability to influence the policies of individual nations through the smallest adjustments in the currency market. Sometimes, just a seemingly insignificant canceled contract, a withdrawn loan was enough to trigger a domino effect that altered the entire global balance of power. In discreet rooms, meetings continued to take place. Hands silently clasped across layers of intertwined interests. No one believed that power could forever be concentrated in one place, but no one knew where the next center would emerge. The flow of finance, ambition, calculation, and betrayal continued to surge across generations, transforming the face of the entire modern world. History continues to be written, not just on dry pages, but by the very lives, destinies, and unfulfilled dreams of countless people who were witnesses, even victims, of an unending power game. And so, as a new order gradually stabilized out of chaos, larger questions about ethics, the limits of power, and the price paid for decisions made in the shadows began to haunt the minds of an entire generation. The circulation of capital, makeshift alliances, betrayals, and changes created a new social structure where nothing was immutable but change itself. Ultimately, what remains is not just a lesson for leaders, but a reminder for everyone. Power is never eternal, and each era must pay for its choices. There are powers that exist only in silence, like an underground river rushing beneath the surface, unnoticed by anyone. As money gradually became the supreme power, those who knew how to control it also understood that they could not rely solely on numbers, but also needed to control the flow of information. They built vast networks, from newspapers and radio stations to research organizations and strategic consultancies, where every piece of data was collected, analyzed, and molded before reaching the public. Financiers controlled not just money, but also media channels, transforming information into an invisible but highly potent weapon. Whenever financial markets showed signs of instability, they could amplify a small rumor into a wave of panic, or, conversely, conceal actual signs of crisis to maintain public trust. Research organizations, often presented as objective centers of knowledge, were in reality controlled by a very small group of people, where every conclusion drawn was meticulously calculated for its benefit. There were secret meetings held in luxurious hotels, where taciturn men with cold eyes gathered to share confidential reports, discuss upcoming financial trends, and even decide the fate of entire economic sectors in a matter of minutes. All information gathered, from politics to science, from society to technology, served as raw material for them to craft long-term strategies, not only generating profit, but also consolidating their position within international power networks. When information became a valuable commodity, major banks did not hesitate to invest heavily in this field. They acquired stakes in media companies, founded newspapers, sponsored influential television programs, and even directly participated in shaping public opinion. Every story told, every market analysis released, served a predetermined strategic goal, even if externally disguised as neutral and objective. The power of the information network was not only evident in its ability to manipulate public emotions and trust, but also helped financiers pave the way for major economic and political decisions, even interventions in legislative and judicial processes. By creating a controlled flow of information, they simultaneously warned, guided, and created momentum for their own financial products, monetary policies, or even new social movements. It could be said that information and money had become two sides of the same power, complementing each other to form a new force no longer limited by national borders. No one knew the entire structure of this network except those involved. They used the most advanced technologies, from big data analytics systems to artificial intelligence algorithms, to predict trends, control risks, and maximize profits. In their hands, information was no longer a natural flow, but a product meticulously coordinated and controlled from source to end. Therefore, every investment decision, every reaction to market fluctuations was meticulously prepared and rarely failed. Many once believed that the world would become more transparent with the development of information technology. But in reality, only a very small group, those who controlled the flow of data, were the ones who truly decided the fate of millions of others. This was a new kind of power, the power of the information age, where words, light as a feather, carried enough weight to sway international financial markets. All of this unfolded silently, persistently, revealing only the smallest traces to those astute enough to perceive this profound change. As the information network tightened its grip, real power began to recede from widely recognized faces. The time had come when, on the surface of society, only a few public figures sparkled as representatives. But beneath lay a colossal structure of the ruling elite, who not only manipulated markets, but also shaped political and cultural order. Financiers, politicians, media moguls, and transnational corporations gradually merged into a tight alliance, where every decision made was the result of countless negotiations, concessions, and exchanges of interests. Each link in the system had its own role, creating a sophisticated mechanism for distributing power. A major news story disseminated by one media outlet was immediately amplified through partner channels, collaborating with economic interest groups to create a ripple effect. When market stability was needed, all media outlets uniformly reassured the public, directing opinion towards constructive solutions. But when fluctuations needed to be exploited, messages were skillfully adjusted to accelerate investment waves or stimulate other financial activities. The coordination between banking groups, politicians, and media was not just at a tactical level, but had become a vital strategy for all. Earth-shattering events were handled deftly, often being merely the tip of the iceberg of conflicts and negotiations that had long taken place in closed meetings. The outside world witnessed continuous movements, but the core of power still revolved around a few individuals who knew how to balance public visibility and secrecy. There were individuals who appeared in the media only a few times, but were at the center of all major decisions. They did not need fame, did not need public appearances. They only needed to maintain their network of interests and control the flows of information and capital. These interest groups often did not directly put their names on any deals, but were the coordinators, apportioning shares, and ready to sacrifice pawns when necessary to protect their core power. Sometimes financiers cooperated to build a new financial system. At other times, they became rivals, ready to strike fiercely to snatch influence on the international stage. This flexibility in relationships was the secret that helped the ruling elite overcome major upheavals, from financial crises to global policy changes. There was no absolute loyalty, only interests weighed on the scales every day. This made power increasingly elusive, increasingly hidden deeper within the complex layers of modern society. These major players never fully revealed themselves. They used the media to obscure their true activities, employing nonprofit organizations, investment funds, and shell companies to operate their transnational power system. There, every law, every regulation could be bent if sufficient pressure was applied or commensurate rewards were promised. Official meetings were often just the tip of the iceberg. The real agreements took place in closed rooms, where all secrets were absolutely protected. It was not hard to realize that this structure not only changed how the economy operated, but also profoundly impacted the daily lives of individuals. The decision of a small group of people in a distant place could directly affect the fate of millions, from food prices and jobs to social policies. The more layers of intermediaries, the harder it was to trace who truly controlled. This was the invisible hand, where power bore no specific name, had no fixed face, yet was always present, manipulating every major and minor movement of the modern world. After the invisible power structure had stabilized, the world entered a phase where every shock was systemic, no longer localized crises. Each market tremor triggered a chain reaction that spread globally. Financial tsunamis were no longer unexpected accidents, but the inevitable result of a system designed to maximize benefits for the few and disperse risks among the many. When bubbles burst, damages were not distributed equally, and those who suffered the heaviest losses were rarely the ones who caused them. In those chaotic moments, major financial families clearly demonstrated their survival instincts. They did not panic like the masses, did not sell off in despair, but calmly observed, waited, then acted at the right moment. When markets collapsed and assets depreciated, they acquired what was once unattainable. Small banks disappeared, weak businesses were devoured, while the core system was restructured in a way that benefited those who controlled the crisis. In their eyes, crisis was not a disaster, but an opportunity for purification. It was noteworthy that after each collapse, power did not weaken, but became even more concentrated. New regulations were enacted in the name of market stability, but actually strengthened the position of large corporations, making entry barriers increasingly high. The public was reassured with bailout packages and promises of reform, but the largest capital flows still went in the same familiar direction. Public trust was damaged, but the system remained resilient, even becoming more sophisticated after each impact. The consequences of financial waves were not just in the numbers of losses, but also in profound changes to the social structure. The gap between rich and poor widened, the middle class eroded, and a sense of injustice quietly accumulated. Many began to doubt official explanations, but lacked sufficient data to see the whole picture. Meanwhile, financiers continued to adjust their strategies, investing in technology, data, and new tools to control risks better, faster, and more accurately. There was always a recurring paradox. Those who caused crises rarely paid the price, while those unrelated suffered the heaviest consequences. This was not due to chance, but the result of a system built to protect itself. When everything collapsed, responsibility was dispersed, blame was blurred, and public attention was quickly diverted to other topics. Time passed, memories of crises faded until a new cycle began. In this context, questions of ethics and justice became increasingly difficult to answer. Could a system be considered sustainable when it needed crises to renew itself? How long could stability achieved by sacrificing the trust and livelihoods of the many last? These questions had no clear answers because those capable of answering them were precisely those who benefited most from such ambiguity. After each tsunami, the world entered a period of relative calm. But this was merely the calm before the next storm. Financial families, with experience accumulated over generations, understood that this cycle would repeat. They prepared, not only with money but with information, networks, and adaptability. And while the majority of humanity tried to heal old wounds, the power system had already begun to lay the groundwork for the next future, where new challenges were silently forming. Financial power, after tsunamis, always knew how to adapt without fully revealing itself. When society thought everything was settled, the true controllers retreated another step, fortifying their networks, adjusting the rules, while leaving behind bitter lessons for the rest of the world. History always showed that each crisis cycle was just one link in the endless loop of power, where money, information, and tacit understanding replaced all traditional conventions. There were times when all warnings about financial risks seemed forgotten, replaced by waves of blind trust in technological progress, in new control systems, in the ability to accurately predict every fluctuation. But each time that trust peaked, reality reminded them with an unexpected collapse. Financial power centers moved constantly, sometimes concentrating in New York, then shifting to London, then heading towards emerging markets. Wherever they went, the nature of the game did not change. The greatest power always belonged to those who knew how to conceal their ambitions, control information, and manipulate the reactions of the crowd. Observing this chain of events, it was not difficult to recognize the greatest paradox of financial history: the strange survival ability of old power conglomerates. Despite being criticized, investigated, and even broken up by law, they could reappear in new, more sophisticated, and powerful forms. This evolution was not only based on money, but also on controlling society's core values: trust, expectations, and even fear. The future did not promise a lasting order, but certainly new cycles would emerge with ever greater challenges for both the old system and the rising new forces. The game between traditional financial families and global technology corporations, between mainstream information and decentralized data flows, was opening up a new era where there were no clear boundaries between overt and invisible power. Each generation had to ask itself whether it could break the loop of history or would simply be the next link extending the chain of insecurity. Behind every change, the greatest remaining factor was humanity's will to resist and the desire to see the truth clearly. Those who were victims, who lost everything after each crisis, would continue to seek to identify, speak out, and force the system to change from within. No one could remain outside the game of power, for even apathy would be drawn into the common vortex of a globalized society. The price of freedom, of transparency, of justice was never cheap. But it was an essential problem for anyone who did not want to live forever in the shadows of invisible hands. And so, as one cycle closed, new hope was kindled. Though fragile, though fraught with danger, because no matter how powerful, how sophisticated financial power might be, it could not prevent the transformation of time and humanity's desire for self-determination. History would turn a new page. But the traces of old loops would remain, a silent warning to any generation that wished to control its own destiny.